The chamber went silent the moment Laura Bennett rose from her seat. I remember gripping the edge of my console so hard that my claws left marks in the metal. Every other delegate in that room was still arguing, still shouting over each other about trade routes and mining rights. And none of them noticed what I noticed. None of them saw the way she folded her hands together, the way her eyes moved slowly across every species seated in that circular hall, as if she were memorizing our faces for the last time. I had served as a recorder for the Galactic Council for over 40 cycles. I had watched 1,000 votes pass through that chamber. I had watched species rise and species fall, watched alliances form and dissolve, watched the slow machinery of galactic law grind forward one compromise at a time. I thought I understood how power worked among the stars. I thought I understood the order of things. I was wrong. The vote that day was simple on paper, a resolution to allow the Corvin Assembly to take administrative control of a small human settlement called Ashvale, citing some buried clause about unclaimed resource zones. It was the kind of vote that happened every cycle, the kind nobody questioned anymore, because humanity rarely objected to anything. They had always been the quiet ones, the newcomers, the species everyone tolerated but nobody truly respected. They sat at the edge of the chamber. They spoke softly when they spoke at all. They lost most votes that touched their own territory, and they always accepted the outcome without complaint. So when the council called for the final tally, and the human seat showed no objection, nobody was surprised. Until Laura Bennett stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not call for a debate. She simply looked at the chairperson, a tall insectoid being named Voss Calran, and said words I will remember until the day I die. You will want to remember this moment. Then she turned, gathered the small data tablet in front of her, and walked out of the chamber without looking back. I laughed. I am ashamed to admit that now, but I laughed, along with half the room. It seemed like such a small, almost pitiful gesture. A single delegate from a species with no real military presence, no significant fleet, no history of conflict beyond a handful of minor border disputes, walking out of a vote she had already lost. We assumed it was theater. We assumed she wanted sympathy, or perhaps a delay so her government could lodge a formal complaint through proper channels. Humans were known for their paperwork, their patience, their endless willingness to accept unfair terms rather than cause a disturbance. I did not think about her again for the rest of that day. I should have. The Corvin fleet moved into Ashvale system 3 days later, exactly as the resolution allowed. 6 warships, modest by galactic standards, enough to establish orbital presence and begin the transfer of administrative control. I read the report myself the following morning, scanning it the way I scanned dozens of similar reports every week. Routine annexation, standard procedure, human government formally noted for the record. No response expected. There was no response. For 2 full days, nothing happened. The Corvin ships held position. Human authorities on the ground continued their normal operations, neither resisting nor cooperating, simply existing as they always had. It looked, to anyone watching, like quiet surrender. Another small victory for a species that had grown used to losing. Then, on the 3rd night, every signal coming out of Ashvale systems stopped. Not destroyed, not jammed, simply gone, as if someone had reached out and turned off a light switch for an entire star system. The Corvin fleet's last transmission was a routine status update. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. And then silence, the kind of silence that has no explanation attached to it. It took the Corvin Assembly 9 days to send an inquiry vessel to investigate. I remember sitting in the records office reading the preliminary report when it finally arrived, and I remember the way my hands went still over the console. The 6 warships were gone, not wrecked, not drifting as debris, gone, with no trace, no distress signal ever logged, no wreckage field, nothing. The settlement of Ashvale itself was untouched, its buildings intact, its infrastructure functioning, its population accounted for and unharmed. The human colonists simply reported that the Corvin ships had left orbit on the 3rd night and never returned. That was the official story, and for a long while, it was the only story anyone had. I want you to understand something about how the galaxy worked before that day. We had grown comfortable in our hierarchies, comfortable in our assumptions about which species held power and which species simply existed within the boundaries others drew for them. Humanity had joined the wider galactic community only a few generations earlier, and from the very first day, they had been placed near the bottom of that hierarchy. Not enslaved, not openly oppressed, just quietly dismissed. Their technology was unremarkable by our standards. Their fleet was small. Their territory was modest. They spoke of peace constantly, of cooperation, of patience, and so naturally, we assumed patience was simply all they had to offer. We mistook their silence for weakness. I think, looking back now, that this was the single greatest miscalculation in the recorded history of the galaxy. In the weeks following the disappearance of the Corvin fleet, I began noticing small things that I had previously ignored. Human trade ships, normally predictable in their routes and schedules, began arriving late, or not arriving at all, with brief automated messages citing maintenance delays. Human diplomats who had once attended every minor council session, sitting quietly in the back rows, simply stopped appearing. Their seats remained empty, week after week, with no explanation offered and none requested. I asked a colleague of mine, a Valkyrie archivist named Sarah Mott, whether she found this strange. She waved a clawed hand dismissively and told me humans were probably dealing with some internal political matter, the kind of thing their species was known for. Endless committees and procedures that swallowed months at a time. I wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe her. But there was a feeling I could not shake, a low and persistent unease that grew heavier with each passing week. I had spent my entire career studying patterns, watching how species behaved under pressure, how they reacted to insult or injury or loss. And the pattern I now saw forming around humanity did not match anything in my experience. They were not panicking. They were not mobilizing for open conflict. They were not issuing demands or threats or formal protests through the Council's diplomatic channels. They were simply withdrawing, quietly and methodically, like a tide pulling back from a shore before something enormous arrives. I remember an old story that circulated among the lower staff of the Council, the kind of tale told in break rooms and quiet corridors, usually dismissed as exaggeration or rumor. It concerned a border species called the Drenic Wardens, a relatively aggressive faction known for raiding smaller settlements along contested space. Years earlier, before humanity had even formally joined the Council, the Wardens had attacked a remote human outpost, assuming it to be undefended and unimportant. The story went that the Wardens were never heard from again, not destroyed in any battle anyone witnessed, not conquered in any war anyone declared, simply erased, their settlements abandoned, their fleet vanished, their names slowly disappearing from trade registries and star charts until newer generations forgot they had ever existed at all. I had always assumed this was nothing more than a cautionary tale, the kind of myth that grows up around any unfamiliar species, exaggerated through repetition until it becomes something closer to legend than fact. But as I sat in my office that evening, watching another empty human seat in another quiet council session, I found myself wondering, for the first time, whether that story might have contained more truth than I had ever allowed myself to consider. Something was happening. Something patient, something deliberate, something that had been building for far longer than any of us understood. And deep in my chest, beneath the comfortable assumptions I had carried for 40 cycles of service, I felt the first true stirrings of fear. I did not yet know how right I was to be afraid. I spent the following month trying to convince myself that nothing unusual was happening, and I failed completely. It began with the trade reports. Every quarter, the Council's Economic Division compiled a summary of interstellar commerce, tracking the flow of goods, resources, and currency between member species. Humanity's contribution to that report had always been modest but steady, a reliable thread woven into the larger tapestry of galactic trade. Grain shipments from their agricultural colonies, rare alloys mined from their outer systems, small but dependable exports that other species had come to depend upon without ever truly appreciating them. That quarter's report showed something I had never seen before. Human trade activity had fallen by nearly 60% across every major route, not through any formal announcement, not through any official withdrawal from commerce agreements, but simply through absence. Ships that should have departed did not depart. Contracts that should have been renewed expired quietly, with no human representative present to discuss new terms. I brought this to the attention of my superior, a broad-shouldered Talreni administrator named Corwin Vale, who had overseen economic relations for nearly 2 decades. He listened to my concerns with the patient, slightly condescending expression he reserved for junior staff, who he believed were overreacting. Humans are unpredictable in their internal politics, he told me. They have elections, transitions of power, internal disagreements that take time to resolve. This is likely nothing more than a temporary disruption. Give it another quarter, things will normalize. I wanted to believe him. He had decades more experience than I did, and his confidence was, in its own way, comforting. But I had spent too many nights reviewing the data, cross-referencing trade patterns with diplomatic activity, with military positioning reports, with every scrap of information I could access through my modest clearance level. And the picture that emerged was not one of internal disruption. It was the picture of a species pulling inward, consolidating, preparing. For what, I did not know. And that uncertainty was, in some ways, more frightening than any clear threat could have been. Around this time, I began hearing whispers from colleagues stationed at outer trade hubs, places where human ships still occasionally pass through on their way to distant systems. The whispers were always second-hand, always vague, the kind of stories that grow more dramatic with each retelling. But certain details repeated often enough that I began to take them seriously. Human ships, when they did appear, were larger than before. Their hull designs had changed, becoming sleeker, more angular, fitted with systems that none of our scanning technology could properly identify. Crews aboard these vessels were described as unusually quiet, professional, almost to the point of unsettling, with none of the casual friendliness humans had once been known for during routine docking procedures. One report, from a fueling station near the edge of contested space, described a human supply vessel that arrived without the standard identification beacon active. When station personnel attempted to make contact, they received a brief, polite message indicating the ship was operating under a new protocol and would not be requiring station services. The vessel refueled itself using equipment none of the station staff had ever seen before, completed its business in less than an hour, and departed without further communication. I found myself thinking constantly about Laura Bennett, about the calm certainty in her voice when she told us we would want to remember that moment. I began to understand that she had not been speaking in anger or frustration. She had been speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew exactly what was about to happen, someone who had simply been waiting for the rest of the galaxy to catch up. I requested access to historical records concerning humanity's earliest interactions with the wider galactic community, hoping to better understand what kind of species we were truly dealing with. Much of what I found matched the general narrative everyone already knew. Humanity had been a relatively young spacefaring species when first contact occurred, possessing technology that was, by galactic standards, unremarkable. Their fleet was small. Their territory was limited to a single home system and a handful of nearby colonies. They had been welcomed into the council not out of respect, but out of a kind of polite tolerance, the way one might welcome a smaller, weaker neighbor simply because excluding them seemed unnecessarily cruel. But buried within those records, in footnotes and addendums that most researchers had likely never bothered to read carefully, I found something curious: references to several earlier incidents, scattered across decades, involving smaller species or factions that had attempted to take advantage of humanity's apparent weakness. In every single case, the aggressor simply disappeared from galactic records within a relatively short period afterward. No declarations of war, no public conflicts, no dramatic battles recorded in any official archive. Just silence, and then absence. I brought my findings to Sarah Mott one evening, hoping she might help me make sense of what I was seeing. She read through my notes carefully, her antennae twitching the way they always did when she was concentrating, and when she finally looked up at me, her expression had lost all of its earlier dismissiveness. "This cannot simply be coincidence," she said quietly. "I do not think it is," I told her. We sat together in silence for a long while after that, neither of us quite willing to say aloud what we were both beginning to suspect: that humanity's reputation as a patient, peaceful, somewhat weak species had never been the whole truth, that perhaps their patience was not a limitation at all, but a choice, a deliberate restraint exercised by a species that understood something about power that the rest of us had never been forced to learn. 3 weeks later, the council received a formal notice from the Corvin Assembly, requesting an emergency session. I was present in the chamber when their lead delegate, a sharp-featured being named Director Halvex, stood to address the assembled species. His voice, normally measured and confident, carried an unmistakable tremor. He explained that 2 additional Corvan settlements, both located near contested border regions previously involved in disputes with human territory, had gone completely silent within the past several days. No distress signals, no wreckage, no survivors reported missing, because there was no evidence anyone had been harmed at all. Simply an absence of communication, populations and infrastructure intact, according to limited remote scans, but every official channel utterly silent. He demanded the council take action, demanded an investigation, demanded that humanity be formally questioned about their possible involvement. The human seat, as it had been for weeks, remained empty. A representative from the Velkari delegation rose to suggest that without any direct evidence linking these incidents to human activity, the council could not reasonably summon a species that had not even been formally accused of wrongdoing. The debate that followed stretched on for hours, delegates arguing over jurisdiction, evidence standards, the proper diplomatic procedure for addressing unverified concerns. I sat through all of it with a growing certainty that none of these procedures mattered anymore. That somewhere beyond the boundaries of our comfortable rule-bound chamber, something far older and more deliberate than our council's authority was already in motion, and that no resolution we passed, no formal protest we lodged, would have any bearing whatsoever on what was coming. I left the chamber that night and walked the long corridor back toward the records office alone, my mind replaying every detail I had gathered over the past month. The vanished fleet, the withdrawn trade, the strange, quiet ships with their unidentifiable systems. The old story of the Drenic Wardens, erased so thoroughly that most of the galaxy had forgotten they ever existed. I thought about Laura Bennett's calm, steady voice, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what kind of warning she had given us. We had spent generations treating humanity's restraint as proof of their weakness. We had voted against their interests, dismissed their concerns, annexed their territory whenever it proved convenient, all because we believed they lacked the strength or the will to respond. We had never once considered that their silence might simply be the calm, deliberate quiet of a species choosing, again and again, not to act, while carefully keeping count of every slight against them. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat at my window, watching the slow rotation of the station against the endless dark beyond, and I found myself wondering, with a dread I could not quite name, how much longer that patience would last. I did not have to wait much longer for my answer. 2 days later, every scanner array along the Council's outer monitoring network detected a single vessel entering neutral territory. It was human, and it had not come to negotiate. The reports reached me before the official announcement did, the way important information always seemed to travel faster through whispered conversations and hurried messages than through proper channels. A single human warship had entered the neutral zone surrounding the Council's primary diplomatic station, the very heart of galactic governance, the place where every major treaty had been signed and every significant dispute had been settled for the past 2 centuries. One ship, not a fleet, not even a small squadron, a single vessel, drifting silently into position, roughly 40,000 kilometers from the station, broadcasting no hails, issuing no demands, requesting nothing. It simply arrived, and then it waited. I rushed to the observation deck along with dozens of other station personnel, all of us crowding around the wide viewports to see for ourselves what every sensor array was already confirming. The ship hung in the darkness like something carved from shadow itself, its hull a deep, matte black that seemed to swallow the starlight around it rather than reflect it. There were no visible running lights along its surface, no decorative markings, nothing that suggested ceremony or display. It looked less like a warship and more like a single, patient eye, watching everything and revealing nothing. I overheard a Talreni technician beside me, whispering to a colleague that the vessel's energy signature alone dwarfed anything in the Council's defense fleet combined. I did not know whether to believe the figures she was reciting, but the fear in her voice told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the station's military analysts were taking this single, silent arrival. For the first 6 hours, nothing happened. The ship did not move. It did not respond to any of the standard diplomatic hails the Council's communications officers attempted to send. It simply held its position, an immovable presence at the edge of our most important gathering place, and the longer it remained silent, the more unbearable that silence became. Director Halvex, still shaken from his own report only days earlier, convinced the Council's Security Committee to authorize a small escort of investigation vessels, 3 modest patrol craft, tasked with approaching the human warship to establish contact and assess its intentions. I remember standing in the records office, watching the live feed alongside dozens of other staff members as those 3 ships slowly advanced through the dark toward that waiting silhouette. They never reached it. The feed showed the patrol craft closing the distance steadily, their telemetry data streaming normally, their pilots reporting nothing unusual. And then, within the span of perhaps 4 seconds, all 3 signals simply stopped. No explosion visible on the feed, no debris field forming, no final distress call, no garbled transmission cut short mid-sentence. The ships were simply there, and then they were not, their telemetry replaced by silence, as complete and absolute as the silence that had swallowed the Corvin fleet weeks earlier. The human warship had not moved at all during the entire encounter. A heavy, suffocating quiet fell over the records office. I remember looking around at my colleagues, all of us staring at our screens, none of us quite able to process what we had just witnessed. We had grown so accustomed to galactic conflicts following predictable patterns, weapons fire visible across vast distances, wreckage fields marking the aftermath of battle, the entire grim ceremony of warfare playing out in ways we understood and could document. This was something else entirely. This was something that defied every assumption we had built our understanding of military power upon. Director Halvex demanded an explanation from the human warship through every available channel, his voice growing increasingly desperate as hour after hour passed without response. The Council's Security Committee debated whether to authorize a larger response, perhaps an actual combat fleet capable of matching whatever capability had just erased 3 patrol vessels without leaving a single trace. In the end, no such fleet was sent. Whether out of caution or simple fear, I cannot say for certain, but I suspect every delegate in that chamber understood, on some deep instinctive level, that sending more ships would accomplish nothing except adding more names to a growing list of disappearances. It was nearly 20 hours after the warship's arrival when something finally changed. A single transmission reached the station, brief and unceremonious, carrying none of the formal diplomatic language the Council typically expected from official communications. I was given access to the recording several hours later, once it had been cleared through the appropriate security channels, and I have listened to it more times than I can count since that day. The voice belonged to a woman, calm and measured, speaking with the same unshaken certainty I remembered from Laura Bennett's final words in the Council chamber weeks earlier. "This vessel is not here to negotiate," the voice said. "It is here to observe." That was all. No threats, no demands, no explanation for the patrol craft that had vanished only hours earlier. Just a single statement, delivered with the kind of quiet finality that left no room for argument or further questioning. The ship remained in position for 3 more days, utterly motionless, utterly silent, simply watching the station and everything that moved around it. Council sessions continued during that time, though the usual energy of debate and disagreement had been replaced by a tense, watchful caution. Delegates spoke more carefully. Votes that might have once been contentious passed quickly, with little discussion, as if every species present had suddenly developed a heightened awareness of how their decisions might be perceived by whoever, or whatever, was monitoring them from that silent black hull beyond the station. I spent much of those 3 days in the archive, searching through every fragment of information I could find about human military capability, hoping to understand what kind of technology could erase 3 ships without leaving any visible trace. I found very little. Humanity's official military disclosures to the Council, filed years earlier as a condition of their membership, described a modest defense fleet, technology roughly comparable to several mid-tier species, nothing that should have been capable of what I had personally witnessed. It became increasingly clear to me that those disclosures had either been deliberately understated or that humanity's capabilities had grown so significantly in the years since that the Council's records were simply catastrophically outdated. I shared my growing concerns with Sarah Mott during one of our evening discussions, and she offered a theory that I have never been able to fully dismiss. She suggested that humanity, understanding from their very first contact with the wider galaxy, how quickly weaker species were exploited and dismissed, had made a deliberate choice to present themselves as far less capable than they truly were. That every patient, restrained, seemingly weak interaction we had witnessed over the years had been, in fact, a careful performance, designed to buy them the time and space needed to grow into something the rest of the galaxy would eventually be forced to reckon with. If she was correct, and I have come to believe she was, then humanity had spent decades allowing themselves to be underestimated on purpose, absorbing insult after insult, annexation after annexation, all while quietly building toward a moment when patience would no longer serve their interests. With that moment, it seemed, had finally arrived. On the fourth day, the ship moved for the first time since its arrival. It did not approach the station. It did not power any visible weapon systems that our sensors could detect. It simply rotated slowly, almost gracefully, until its forward section faced outward, away from the station, toward the wider expanse of neutral space beyond. And then, without any further communication, it departed, accelerating away at a speed our tracking systems struggled to properly calculate before it vanished entirely from our sensor range. The relief that swept through the station was immediate and almost physical, a collective exhale from thousands of beings who had spent 4 days holding their breath. Council sessions resumed their normal rhythm within hours, delegates speaking once again with their usual confidence, as if the danger had simply passed, and normal life could now continue. I did not share their relief. I understood, even then, that the ship's departure was not an ending. It was a beginning. A single vessel had arrived, observed, demonstrated a capability none of us could properly explain or counter, and then left without ever stating its true purpose. It had not come to threaten the Council directly. It had come to make something unmistakably clear, a message delivered not through words, but through presence alone. Humanity was no longer the quiet, struggling species we had spent decades dismissing. They had become something else entirely, something patient and precise, and utterly unwilling to be ignored any longer. And somewhere among the scattered systems and contested borders of our galaxy, species who had wronged humanity over the years were about to discover exactly what that change truly meant. I did not know it yet, sitting in my quiet office that evening, but the events I had witnessed over the past weeks were only the opening movement of something far larger, something that would, within a matter of months, completely reshape the balance of power across every system I had ever known. I would soon learn the full truth, through records I never expected to access, and the words of a captured human officer who answered every question with a calm that unsettled me more than any threat could have. But that is a story for what came next. The opportunity to learn the truth came sooner than I expected, and through a route I never could have predicted. Roughly 6 weeks after the silent warship's departure, the Council received word that a human officer had been detained by a joint security patrol near a contested trade corridor, following what officials described as a minor jurisdictional misunderstanding. I later learned the full circumstances were far more complicated than that simple summary suggested, but at the time, all anyone knew was that humanity had, for the first time since the chamber walkout, agreed to allow one of their own to sit for formal questioning before a council-appointed panel. I was assigned to the records team responsible for documenting the proceedings, a task that placed me in the observation gallery for every session, close enough to watch the officer's face as he answered question after question with a composure that none of us quite knew how to interpret. His name was Henry Dalton, a mid-ranking officer whose insignia suggested experience with logistics and fleet coordination rather than direct combat command. He sat through 3 full days of questioning without once raising his voice, without once showing the frustration or fear that interrogation panels typically expected from detained individuals. He answered every question with the same calm, measured tone, the same unhurried patience that I had come to recognize as distinctly, almost unsettlingly human. Director Halvex led much of the questioning himself, clearly hoping to extract some admission of aggressive intent, some confirmation that humanity was preparing for open conflict against the wider galactic community. Officer Dalton gave him nothing of the sort. "We are not preparing for war," he told the panel during the second day of questioning. "We are simply no longer pretending to be something we are not." When pressed to explain what he meant, he described, in calm and almost clinical detail, a practice that humanity had apparently maintained since their very first contact with the wider galaxy. Every slight, every broken agreement, every unfair vote, every annexed colony had been carefully documented and preserved within human government records, not as grievances to be acted upon immediately, but as a comprehensive accounting of every injustice committed against them. He called it, simply, the ledger. For decades, he explained, humanity had made a deliberate decision to absorb these injustices without retaliation, understanding that a young species with limited military strength could not hope to challenge an established galactic order through force. Instead, they focused their resources inward, developing technology, expanding their understanding of the wider universe, and quietly building a level of capability that they had no intention of revealing until the appropriate moment arrived. The Council's resolution allowing the Corvin Assembly to annex the settlement of Ashvale, he told us, had been the final entry required to close that ledger. I remember the silence that followed his explanation, a silence that stretched across the entire observation gallery, as every delegate present slowly began to understand the true scale of what humanity had been quietly preparing for. Director Halvex asked, his voice noticeably tighter than before, what exactly closing the ledger meant in practical terms. Officer Dalton's answer was simple, and it has stayed with me ever since. It means we no longer feel obligated to ask for what is fair. It means we are prepared to ensure it ourselves. Over the following sessions, through careful and persistent questioning, the panel managed to piece together a clearer picture of what had been happening across the galaxy since the human warship's appearance at the diplomatic station. The pattern that emerged was, in its own way, more disturbing than open warfare would have been. Species and factions identified within humanity's records as having committed significant wrongs against human interests were being visited, one at a time, by small human task forces. These were not invasions in any traditional sense. There were no reports of widespread destruction, no accounts of populations harmed or territories seized. Instead, the task forces focused with surgical precision on dismantling the specific capabilities that had allowed each wrongdoing to occur in the first place. Military installations responsible for territorial aggression were rendered inoperable through means our own engineers could not fully explain. Their weapons systems disabled without any visible damage to the surrounding infrastructure. Economic networks built upon exploitative trade agreements found themselves quietly cut off from essential resources, their access to critical supply chains redirected through channels controlled by human commercial interests that had, apparently, been carefully positioned for exactly this purpose years in advance. In several documented cases, governing officials directly responsible for decisions that had harmed human colonies were simply removed from positions of authority through methods that remained frustratingly unclear in every report I managed to access, replaced by more moderate leadership willing to negotiate fair terms with human representatives. What struck me most, listening to Officer Dalton describe these events with the same unshaken calm he maintained throughout every session, was the complete absence of unnecessary harm in any of it. Humanity was not seeking destruction. They were seeking correction, precise and deliberate, addressing each injustice with exactly the amount of action required to resolve it, and nothing more. This restraint, somehow, made the entire situation more frightening than open conflict ever could have been. A species capable of inflicting widespread devastation, but choosing, again and again, to exercise careful and exact precision instead, was a species operating from a position of overwhelming confidence. They were not afraid of consequences, because they understood, with complete certainty, that no one in the galaxy possessed the capability to meaningfully oppose them. I asked Officer Dalton, during a brief recess when I was permitted limited access to him for record clarification purposes, why humanity had chosen this particular moment to act, after so many years of patient restraint. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. Patience has a purpose, he said. It allows a species to grow without drawing unwanted attention. But patience is not infinite, and it was never meant to be a substitute for justice. We waited until we no longer needed to ask permission to seek it. I found myself unable to respond to that, and I noticed several other panel members shared my silence. Over the following weeks, as the Council struggled to determine an appropriate response to this new reality, I continued my own research into the full scope of what had occurred. I discovered that the Corvin Assembly, having lost the fleet at Ashvale, and 2 additional settlements shortly afterward, had quietly entered into private negotiations with human representatives, agreeing to a complete withdrawal of their annexation claims, along with substantial reparations to the affected human colonies. These negotiations were never formally announced to the wider council, and I suspect they were deliberately kept quiet to avoid public acknowledgement of how thoroughly the Corvin Assembly had been forced to capitulate. Similar patterns repeated across at least a dozen other species and factions that I managed to track through careful cross-referencing of trade reports, diplomatic communications, and military status updates. In every case, the resolution followed the same basic structure: a quiet, precise demonstration of human capability, followed by private negotiations that resulted in the wronged party receiving compensation, territory, or formal apology, all without a single public declaration of conflict ever being filed with the Council. It became clear to me that humanity had no interest in dominating the galaxy through open conquest. Their goal, as Officer Dalton had described it, was correction rather than control. They sought to settle the ledger, to ensure that every injustice committed against them was properly addressed, and once that was accomplished, they appeared entirely content to return to a quieter, more reserved presence within the galactic community. This realization did not make the situation any less unsettling. If anything, it deepened my understanding of just how carefully and thoughtfully humanity had approached this entire process. They were not driven by anger or a desire for revenge. They were driven by something closer to principle, a deep and unwavering belief that fairness, once denied for long enough, eventually demanded to be restored. Officer Dalton's detention concluded after 8 days, with the Council ultimately determining that no formal charges could reasonably be brought against him, given the absence of any direct evidence connecting him personally to specific incidents under investigation. He was released to a waiting human transport that arrived at the station with the same quiet, unannounced efficiency that had characterized every human action I had witnessed over the preceding months. Before he departed, I was given a brief opportunity to speak with him privately, ostensibly to clarify several details for the official record, though I suspect my own curiosity played a larger role in requesting that conversation than any genuine procedural necessity. I asked him whether humanity intended to continue this process indefinitely, whether every future disagreement or unfair decision would now be met with similar consequences. He shook his head slowly, and for the first time during our entire interaction, I saw something resembling genuine warmth in his expression. "The ledger is being closed," he told me, "not because we have grown tired of patience, but because patience without consequence eventually becomes an invitation for further harm. Once balance is restored, there will be no need for further correction. We do not wish to be feared, we simply refuse to be dismissed." I have thought about those words many times since that conversation, turning them over carefully, trying to understand the full weight of what they truly meant. A species capable of overwhelming the entire galactic order, choosing restraint not out of weakness, but out of genuine principle, willing to step back the moment fairness had been restored. It was, I realized, a far more complicated and ultimately more hopeful conclusion than I had expected when this entire situation began. Humanity had not sought to conquer us. They had sought only to be treated with the same basic respect and fairness that every other species in the Council had long taken for granted. We had simply never been willing to extend that respect freely, and so they had been forced to demand it instead. As I watched Officer Dalton's transport depart the station, disappearing into the dark expanse beyond our viewports, I understood that the galaxy I had known for 40 cycles of service had fundamentally changed. A new balance had been established, one built not upon comfortable assumptions about which species deserved power and which did not, but upon a far more uncomfortable truth that every delegate in that council would now be forced to remember for the rest of their careers. Humanity's patience had never been a sign of weakness. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to end. In the years that followed those extraordinary events, the galaxy I had known for so long was quietly and permanently transformed. I continued my work within the Council's Records Division, though my role gradually shifted toward something closer to historical documentation, as more and more delegates began requesting access to accurate accounts of what had actually happened during those tense, uncertain months. I suppose it is fitting that I am the one writing this account now, given how thoroughly that period of my life shaped everything that followed. The changes that emerged across the wider galactic community were subtle at first, easy to overlook unless one was paying careful attention. Council sessions, once dominated by aggressive posturing and casual dismissal of smaller or newer member species, began to take on a noticeably more measured tone. Delegates who had once spoken carelessly about annexation or resource claims now approached such discussions with considerably more caution, mindful of the possibility that any decision made in haste might eventually find its way onto someone else's ledger. Humanity itself returned, gradually, to a quieter presence within the council, much as Officer Dalton had suggested they would. Laura Bennett resumed her seat within the chamber several months after her dramatic departure, and I remember watching her take her place once again, with the same calm, unhurried dignity she had carried throughout the entire situation. She never spoke about what had happened during those months, never offered any public explanation or justification for the events that had unfolded across so many systems. She simply continued her work, advocating for fair and balanced treatment of her people's interests, much as she always had. What had changed, unmistakably, was how the rest of us listened to her. Where human proposals had once been routinely dismissed or deprioritized in favor of more established species interests, they now received careful and genuine consideration. Where human objections had once been noted and then quietly ignored, they were now addressed thoughtfully, with delegates clearly understanding that dismissing humanity's concerns carried consequences none of us wished to experience firsthand. I do not believe this shift occurred out of genuine respect, at least not initially. I believe it occurred largely out of fear, a deep and lingering caution born from witnessing exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond the limits of their patience. But over time, something interesting happened. As humanity continued to participate fairly and constructively within the Council, never once attempting to leverage their demonstrated capability for further advantage beyond what justice required, that initial fear slowly began to transform into something closer to genuine respect. The Corvin Assembly, having fully withdrawn from their annexation claims and completed substantial reparations to the affected human colonies, gradually rebuilt a working relationship with human representatives, one built upon considerably more equal footing than had ever existed before. I attended several joint sessions between human and Corvin delegates during this period, and I was struck by how professionally and respectfully both parties conducted themselves, with none of the old condescension that had once characterized so many of their interactions. Similar transformations occurred across nearly every species that had previously taken advantage of humanity's apparent weakness. Trade agreements were renegotiated on fairer terms. Territorial disputes that had once been resolved entirely in favor of more established species began receiving genuinely balanced consideration. The entire structure of galactic governance, while never formally rewritten, had been fundamentally reshaped by the simple, undeniable understanding that humanity could no longer be safely dismissed or exploited. I spoke with Sarah Mott often during this period, both of us still processing the magnitude of what we had witnessed together. She once described the entire situation as the galaxy finally being forced to grow up, to abandon the comfortable assumption that power alone determined who deserved fair treatment, and to recognize instead that fairness was something every species was entitled to, regardless of how new or seemingly weak they appeared upon first contact. I have come to believe she was right. Humanity, for their part, never sought recognition or gratitude for the role they played in reshaping galactic governance. They did not demand apologies from species who had wronged them, beyond the practical reparations necessary to restore genuine balance. They did not seek positions of authority or influence, beyond what their population and contributions genuinely warranted. They simply continued participating as equal members of the galactic community, content with the fairness they had worked so hard and waited so long to finally achieve. I sometimes wonder what might have happened had the Council never passed that final resolution regarding Ashvale, had we simply continued treating humanity with the same casual disregard we had shown them for years prior. Perhaps the ledger would have remained open indefinitely. Perhaps humanity's patience truly was limitless, and we would have continued our comfortable assumptions forever, never learning the lesson that experience ultimately forced upon us. But that resolution was passed, and that lesson was learned, and the galaxy that exists now is, I genuinely believe, considerably more fair and balanced than the one I served for the first half of my career. Officer Dalton's words have stayed with me throughout the years since our conversation, and I find myself returning to them often when discussing this period of history with younger colleagues who never personally witnessed the events I have described. We do not wish to be feared. We simply refuse to be dismissed. I believe that statement captures the entire truth of what humanity sought to accomplish during those months, a truth far more reasonable and far less threatening than the panic and uncertainty that gripped so many of us at the time. Every species now teaches its younger generations about this period, often referred to simply as the reckoning, a careful study of how quickly comfortable assumptions can collapse when tested against a patience that has been deliberately mistaken for weakness. Diplomatic academies across the galaxy now include detailed case studies of humanity's measured, principled response to decades of unfair treatment, using it as an example of how restraint and justice can coexist, how a species can demonstrate overwhelming capability without ever needing to resort to unnecessary destruction in order to make its point understood. I am, as far as I am aware, one of the few remaining individuals from my generation who personally witnessed the entire sequence of events from beginning to end, from that first quiet warning in the council chamber to the final, gradual restoration of genuine balance across the galactic community. I have chosen to record this account not out of pride or vindication, but out of a genuine belief that future generations deserve to understand exactly how close our comfortable, complacent galactic order came to facing consequences far more severe than the measured correction humanity ultimately chose to pursue. We were fortunate, in the end, that the species we had wronged for so long valued fairness over revenge, principle over domination, correction over conquest. I do not believe every species pushed to such extremes would have shown the same restraint. I think of Laura Bennett often, sitting quietly in that council chamber on the day this entire story began, calmly informing us that we would want to remember that moment. I did not understand, at the time, just how completely correct she would prove to be. No species who witnessed those events, who watched the careful, deliberate unfolding of humanity's long-awaited reckoning, ever forgot the lesson it taught us. That patience, however quiet, however prolonged, is never the same as weakness. That fairness denied long enough will eventually be demanded, one way or another, and that the galaxy's newest and once most dismissed member had been, all along, simply waiting for the rest of us to finally understand what they had known from the very beginning. We do not wish to be feared. We simply refuse to be dismissed. I have carried those words with me for the rest of my career, and I suspect every species across this galaxy now carries them as well, whether they choose to admit it or not. This is the account of the day humanity's patience finally ended, and the galaxy, in turn, was finally forced to remember exactly who they had been so carelessly underestimating all along.